video covers Section 5, Setting Permissions for Lambda. Lambda requires two types of permissions. First, event sources need permissions to invoke a Lambda function. Next, Lambda functions need permissions to interact with other AWS services and resources. Permissions are handled through IAM. An IAM resource policy tells the Lambda service which push event sources have permissions to invoke the Lambda function. Resource policies also make it easy to grant access to the Lambda function across AWS accounts. For example, suppose that you need an S3 bucket in account A to invoke your Lambda function in account B. You can create a resource policy that allows account A to invoke the function in account B. Notice that the IAM resource policy is on the bucket, not on the Lambda function. In this example, the resource policy on an S3 bucket gives Amazon S3 permissions to invoke the Lambda function called myFirstFunction. The Lambda execution role grants your Lambda function permissions to access AWS services and resources. You select or create the execution role when you create the function. Two policies are attached to the execution role. The first is the IAM policy. This policy defines the actions that the Lambda function can take on another AWS service or resource, such as writing to a DynamoDB table. The second is the trust policy, which allows the Lambda service to assume the execution role. To grant permissions to Lambda to use the assume role action, you must have permissions for the IAM pass role action. Polling event sources also need the execution role to give the Lambda function permissions to read from the queue or stream. The Lambda function also needs the execution role to poll event sources to be able to read from the queue or stream. IAM policies are associated with a role that another entity, such as Lambda or another resource, can assume. Policies aren't directly attached to a Lambda function. The IAM policy example here allows the Lambda function to perform some CloudWatch logs actions. These actions include creating a log group and log stream and writing to the log stream. The trust policy example gives the Lambda service permissions to assume the role and invoke the Lambda function on your behalf. This example shows code for the AWS Command Line Interface, or AWS CLI. This code gives Amazon SNS permissions to invoke a function and shows the IAM policy statement that results. Here are the key takeaways for this section of the module. Lambda functions require permissions to be invoked and permissions to interact with other services. Both types of permissions are defined by using IAM or trust policies. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.